Okay, we're now going to have a question and answer period. So what I'm going to ask, when you answer, I'm going to ask the panel, when you answer a question, you need to speak directly into the microphone so that both the PA system and the recording can pick up your words. So what we're going to do, this is partially because something happened to me last year. When I come to listen to take your question, I'm going to continue to hold on to the microphone, because last year I had someone who wouldn't stop talking. And this way, if I get something like that this year, I can walk away from you. So, you can use it, you can go, no, you can share this microphone too. Okay, so does anybody have a question for the panel? Okay, I'm coming. What? Okay, okay. This one's for Barbara, so why don't you move the microphone to Barbara?
That's fine. Barbara, I have a question for you, maybe to put your mind at ease, which I'm sure you've already thought of. The abuse that you suffered and didn't talk about to the police in the 1980s, and the abuse that others suffered by the same person in the 1960s, how do you think the police would have reacted had you reported it? Yeah, how would they have reacted? I know how I think they would react, but I want your opinion. What do you think they really would have done at that point, in that day and age?
I'm not sure. I think that clearly by the 1960s, molesting children, raping children was illegal. And so I believe that people would have recognized that. The question that I have asked myself so many times is, if my mother and father had heard these types of allegations against Father Warren, would they have believed it? Because Father Warren was so revered in my world. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that, of course, I'll never know, but I suspect they would not have believed it. But at the same time, I think they would have thought twice before they would have allowed me to go off alone with him, as they did so often. So none of us want to believe that someone we know and love is a child molester, but they're in our communities. And unfortunately, there are victims. We all know victims. And according to the statistics are that 1 in 4 girls is sexually abused before reaching the age of 18, and 1 in 6 boys. So if you do the math, look in this room, how many of us were raped or sodomized as children? For the vast majority of us, we don't tell. According to the Department of Justice, only 10% of victims report their crimes, report the abuse.
I'd like to add something to that. When we first started having seminars on this topic, I had a long conversation with the man who was at that time head of a sex abuse unit, and he said to me that the problem of anything happening is that people do not report. They knew who the molesters were in our Orthodox community. He told me the car the man drove, one of the most serious ones, where he lived, everything about him. He says, my hands are tied. So the hands are tied when you ask about the police. I think we cannot expect the police to do something unless we report. If a victim doesn't come forward, we're powerless. So I think the issue is reporting, not what the police have done.
Next question.
This is actually a question for Rabbi Schwartz. Should one be calling on Shabbat if they know of abuse taking place?
I'm not hearing you, I'm sorry.
The question was, Rav Schwartz, should someone be calling on Shabbat if they are aware of an instance of abuse?
Well, you know who addresses this in that responsive in the Tshuva of Aldenberg talks about that. If it happened on Shabbos about reporting or so forth, he says that you're allowed to do that. You should report it as soon as possible, because the act of abuse is considered something that relates to the concept of a rodef. In Jewish law, it means, let's say you have a hypothetical situation discussed in the Talmud where someone is pursuing a child in order to molest that child, rape or whatever it is. It says anyone who's standing by is allowed to attack the pursuer physically to stop him. It doesn't make any difference whether it's, are they gonna wait till Shabbos is over when the child has already been molested? So Rav Aldenberg is quite clear. It doesn't make any difference. If it happens on Shabbos, it's to be reported immediately. It's a type of aspect of, can call it in the category of pikuach nefesh, because you don't know how much damage can be done, and we hear all these reports of what happens when a child is molested, how it affects his life and everybody around him.
Next question. Please speak. I don't know, Mike, please speak.
Oh, okay.
Who do you want to direct your question?
Well, anybody, I guess, who's, yeah, I appreciate that they're talking about reporting it if somebody's abused, but isn't it also important to prevent it? Also, because these abusers were abused themselves, so isn't it important to talk to, to inform parents, teachers about possibly preventing these children from becoming potential abusers?
I think it's absolutely true that you have to do prevention. And I think that's basically a lot of what Project SHIELD does in terms of educating both children and parents. The fact that someone was abused and therefore they are an abuser is no excuse for prosecution. That person at that point, for whatever reason, has to be away from children and needs to be reported regardless of, yes, we feel sorry that that happened to him. As a matter of fact, probably the largest percentage of people who are in jails have all been sexually abused. So, what should we do? Should we just let everybody out and say, we feel sorry for you? Or are you going to say, we need to protect our children and our children's children, and if there's one man who's going to do it, or 20, we have a job to do.
I want to add one last thing to that, and that is that I think it's really important to make sure, I believe it's extremely important to ensure that we do not start thinking that everyone who was molested as a child is going to grow up and become a child molester. Because in fact, the studies show that victims of abuse are far more likely to harm themselves than to harm someone else. And so please do not assume that those of us who were raped as children are all going to become rapists ourselves.
Can I add one more thing?
No, I have more of a statement to make. I read the book Hush by Aisha Schuyl, so I'm glad to see she has a name and a face. I was very moved by this book. I have another comment to make. I often speak in my family. I'm a little bit of a heretic because I keep telling them that you must make a distinction between the religion and the culture. And you did refer to this thing with the culture. I find today that there's a lot of concentration on the chumras, and there's very little really what I would call Yirah Shamayim. There's a lot of posturing, and it affects many things in the community. And I would like to say that I think the situation is compounded by the fact that with all the chumras today, there is so much suppression and repression in sections of the community that it makes people step out of line, that they don't have options, and that will affect their behavior in many ways. And that's, I believe, one of the reasons that might be attributed to this situation, because while it always existed, I think the numbers of abuse, whether it's domestic abuse or sexual abuse, has skyrocketed, and I think it may be attributed to all these other factors too.
Okay, that question up there.
When you're talking about the obligation to report, if, let's say, a child goes to a therapist or a rabbi or whoever and says, please don't tell anybody, but this is what happened to me. If that person chooses not to report or says, let's bring it to a rabbinical court and does not report it to the police, can they themselves be reported to the police and be, and have things happen?
Barbara, that's probably for you.
Unfortunately, it depends on the age of the victim. If the victim is a child, the victim unfortunately does not get to make that call. So the way the law is set up is the adult has to make the decision and report the crime, whether the child wants that to happen or not. And I suspect that the only reason the child would not want it to happen is because of the environment that the child has been brought up in, wherein saying these things is a horrible thing, and it is an indication of the shame and the guilt that the victim is feeling. And if the adults are successful in helping that victim to recognize it was not his fault or her fault, but rather it was the adult's fault, then I think the child will be able to come to that awareness. But the child doesn't get to make the call. And if the rabbi or the teacher or the therapist is found out later to have had the knowledge and not reported it, they themselves are subject to indictments.
Yes, and that follows with all clergy, I think, as well. I think that we're going to,
One more, let's have one.
I think we're going to stop now,
Yes,
and
please.
I do want to thank everyone for your attention and everyone for coming. And please remember, if you know something, say something. Thank you.